everyone, and welcome to this session wherein we are going to discuss the war poets, World War I poetry, all the historical details, all the social details, all the interesting facts that were there of the World War I war poets. It's going to be an interesting session. Before I begin, I want to once again tell you about your exam, UGC NET exam. It's just around the corner, and I told you about this, that you have two options. One is to revise fully and take up the entire course that I have, and you only have to pay for 2 months and you'll get all of it, all the mock tests that we're going to start with in a few days, all the MCQs that we have already covered and they are ongoing, and all the classes, live classes, recorded classes, everything. Second option is take up only MCQs. If you only want to practice MCQs in these last 2 months, you only have to pay 1,000 and you will get again all the MCQs passed every day, almost every day, topic wise. So I'm giving, let's say, 5 authors and I'll ask MCQs on those 5 authors. They are very nice MCQs, very advanced level, covering all the latest trends like chronology questions, match the following questions, statement based questions, all of that. And in a few days, mock tests also. All of that. And also Sundays we have our test rituals. It's an oral test ritual. It's only to make you more confident in your learning, that I don't give options. It's an oral test. We face each other like that. Okay, so get in touch with me if you want to begin. It's just been 2 days that I had begun with the MCQs on Telegram, and you can join. You will get all of that also. So the details are in the description box. If you're new, get in touch with me over Telegram or WhatsApp and let me know. Okay, now let's dive in back to our topic of war poetry. Okay. War poets. Who were the war poets? British poets who wrote during or about World War I. World War I, when did it happen? 1914 to 1918. Maximum of these, not all, okay, but maximum of these major war poets, they fought in the trenches. And it's also called trench poetry, okay? And they described about the war. Very interestingly, this was the first time, a few years back, there was a policy, an education policy that was passed in Britain, which made elementary education compulsory for everybody, for a particular age group, okay, till 13. So this was a few years back. Now the outcome was that few years later, there was this group of people who were more educated, a certain age group of people which were better educated than the past ones. And this was the first time that these soldiers who went to fight in the World War, because now they were educated, they belonged to that group. क्योंकि वो age थी ना, एक younger section of the people went in the war. These people for the first time wrote about it, and they sent letters home talking about the horrors of the war, what was happening, and it was all fresh account, it was all unfiltered, very emotionally raw accounts. So they fought in the trenches, they described war from the front lines, offering very graphic images. Some also cover World War II, of course, but World War I poets are more closely associated with this poetry wala movement. When we talk about the war poets, generally First World War. Okay. What was the trigger? Now, let's talk about the historical background of the war first. The war started when, after this particular assassination happened of this Franz Ferdinand of Austria in 1914. But the real causes, they were deeper. Of course, it was nationalism, it was imperial ambitions, it was military build-up and complex alliances. For example, Britain, France, Russia versus Germany, Austria, Hungary. What was the scale? It was the first total war involving entire population Not just armies. Over 70 million military personnel, of course, they were mobilized. About 9 million soldiers and about 7 million even civilians, You must have, when we read about the poets, when we read about the other writers as well, we see that during this point of time, even those people who were in different occupations, somebody was a teacher, somebody was a writer, even they were mobilized to the war. So of course, if a person really couldn't fight in the war, they were given different jobs, ambulance jobs, nurse jobs, certain different amount of jobs were required during this time, right? Trench warfare, it dominated the Western Front, especially France, Belgium. So जो soldiers थे, they lived in horrific conditions, mud, rats, lice, constant shelling was happening, constant bombing was happening. New technologies were also there. They had machine guns, they had gas attacks. Gas attacks were mostly chlorine, mustard gas. And there were tanks now. There were air warfare as well. What was the impact? It shattered all the old ideals of glory, of honor, of heroism. If you remember, think about old English poetry. Okay, बहुत पीछे चले जाते हैं. जब भी, whenever there is a talk of war, whenever there is a talk of these battles, it's all described in a very heroic manner. There is one great hero who fights everybody, and it's all glory, honor, and heroism. Even if you listen to the patriotic songs, they are mostly glorifying war. They are showing the heroism of the soldiers, how heroic the war is. But it was not so this time, because one of the reasons was because of these soldiers being educated, and they were giving us a very close look, a very raw and graphic look at what was actually happening, right? So this created a disillusioned generation. It's also called the lost generation. Talking about the social background, now society before and after, pre-war अगर हम बात करें, it was an Edwardian era. Society was very optimistic, hierarchical थी, of course, and confident in progress. You think about the Victorian era and then the Edwardian era. A lot of advancement was happening. Of course, industrial revolution की वजह से there have been ups and downs at every age, but over and above, it was all about technology. It was all about progress that was happening. Patriotism and heroism and nationalism were very strong. Literature mostly celebrated empire, nature, and they romanticized war. For example, let's think about Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade. Now, what was the change during and after the war? Mass death. Mass death happened, and it made all of these old heroic ideals seem very hollow. There was a rise of class consciousness, of course. Officers, they often came from privileged backgrounds, while the common soldiers, they suffered the worst, because hierarchy has always been there, even in army, whether it is Britain or you talk about India, it's been there. Officers come from privileged backgrounds. It did, at least at a point of time. And the common soldiers, they remain common and they suffer the worst. There was an emergence of modernism, of course. In literature, when we talk about the World War I, we say that's when the real modern age begins. High modernism begins. The literature was fragmented. It was very skeptical. It was very realistic now. Okay. Who were the war poets? So as I told you that they were mainly young men. Many of them were from upper middle classes, and they were educated in elite schools also. Not all, but mainly when we talk about the poets, they were mainly educated in elite schools like Eton, Rugby, Oxford, or even Cambridge. Who are the major figures when we talk about the war poets? We have Rupert Brooke. Now, since Rupert Brooke is one of the early writers of the war theme, in the war theme, you will find Rupert Brooke patriotizing war again, glorifying it. For example, his work called The Soldier. Idealistic war poems. But then it changes. Think about Wilfred Owen, most famous, Wilfred Owen. He's famous for the brutal realism that he has given to us. For example, in his work called Dulcet Decorum Est. Then we have Siegfried Sassoon, again a very bitter and satirical poems he has given us. For example, Counterattack. We have Eisen Rosenberg, working class Jewish poet, very raw imagery. Break of the Day in the Trenches, that's his work. Edward Thomas was another person, more melancholic in tone, nature focused hai, but shaped by war. Okay, for example, Rain. And then another name would be Ivor Gurney. He suffered mental breakdowns and he wrote deeply personal war poetry. For example, To His Love. Okay, a bit more before we go on to read. Some interesting facts also I want to give you. For example, as I told you, early war poetry was also patriotic. 1914, 1915 की जो poems थी, again they thought, okay, war हो रही है, heroism है, glorifying है, sacrifice है, duty है. Let's give in all that patriotic thing, nationalism and all. For example, Rupert Brooke. Then it shifted to bitter realism. As war dragged on, as people were more injured, dead, casualties they soared, poets like Wilfred Owen, Sassoon, they depicted horror, they depicted pity and futility. Now the poetry was a kind of protest also to end this brutality, especially Owen and Sassoon. Writing poetry was an act of resistance against the official propaganda. For example, Sassoon की अगर हम बात करें, he attacked that ये जो पूरा एटमॉस्फेयर है वॉर का, मिलिट्री में जो हो रहा है, all of these things he attacked. And there came a time when Sassoon was about to actually face consequences because of what he had written, but then he was saved. He was saved, saying that his mental health is not fine. So his execution didn't take place. He was saved. Then poets were also soldiers. Okay, they were part of the war. That is why they were able to write of such brutality, first-hand experience. So unlike previous generations, these poets actually fought and died. They weren't writing from a safe distance, they were actually there. Then we have the poets' corner of the trenches. Some regiments, especially officers, they had several talented poets. They even joked darkly about it being a literary battalion. तो literary battalion करके नाम दे दिया था. Do you know where did Sassoon and Owen meet? They met at a hospital, shell-shocked. See, the consequences of facing such brutality in war was of course not good for mental health. Time to time these soldiers, these officers were there, and shell-shocked, even these two writers, they were shell-shocked from the war and they met at this hospital. It has become very famous. It's called Craig Lockhart War Hospital. In 1917 they met. And Sassoon actually mentored Owen. Let's talk about the timings of the death. Wilfred Owen was killed just 1 week before the Artemis in November 1918. Matlab everything was going to get solved, or the peace treaty kind of things were happening. And just one. I don't know. I feel this part very sad actually. Also that even when Owen was highly disillusioned because of the war setting, he still went back, He was in the hospital and of course he was writing about all the horrors of the war. He still went back. I don't know why. And he died just 1 week before everything was getting solved. Okay. Another thing is that many of these war poets actually became famous after their deaths. So their work were often collected by friends and editors. Did you know that there were even women war poets, which we don't know about, although less famous? Women like, we have Vera Brittain. She wrote Testament of Youth. And another one is May Wedderburn Cannon. I think you might have not even heard these names. They also wrote movingly about loss and suffering. So the war poets are seen as a bridge between the Victorian or Edwardian era and the modernist break that followed. Okay. And once Wilfred Owen had famously said, "My subject is war, and pity of war. The poetry is in the pity. Okay. And they changed the image of the war. It's no longer noble and romantic, but very wasteful, very pitiful, and very brutal. They created lusting symbols, trenches, poppies, the doomed youth, all became key cultural images. Let's read a bit about it from the slides. So World War I, it's a mechanized, trench-based war with mass casualties. Yeah. Sorry. Now let's come here and talk about the major war poets and their work. So I told you Rupert Brooke. Also let's look at the chronology, okay? 1887 say 1915, Rupert Brooke. He was an early poet, very idealistic, very patriotic tone. His work is, the most famous one is The Soldier, and in line hai bahut famous, if I should die, think only this of me, that there is some corner of a foreign land that is forever England. How patriotic. And he died of blood poisoning en route to war. He was going to the war and blood poisoning ho gaya, and that's how he died. We had Wilfred Owen, 1893 to 1918, most iconic of all of these poets. He was killed in action days before the Artemis, as I told you. Poems reflect very horrific images, pity and injustice of war. He was famous for Dulce et Decorum Est. Very ironic, anti-propaganda, anthem for doomed youth, mourning and ritual. And he says, my subject is war and the pity of war, and as I told you. So very realistic, very graphic. Actually, you can imagine as you read. Uses para rhyme and sonnet form and irony. Then we have Siegfried Sassoon, 1886. Okay, so 1886 he will come before Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen is in 1893. At the end, we'll look at the chronology once. So he was an officer and he was a poet. He started patriotic, but he became totally opposite. He became bitterly anti-war. He's known for satire, he's known for irony, and he's known for blunt critique. Okay, just a minute. Yeah. Okay. So he's famous for poems like The General. I'm sorry about the sound if it is reaching you. There's some work going out. Then They. Suicide in the Trenches. I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life in empty joy. He mentored Wilfred Owen, as I told you, in a war hospital. And as I told you, Sassoon got into a scandal. So he wrote this work called The Soldier's Declaration in July 1917, and he wrote a very bold public statement. It was titled Finished with the War, a Soldier's Declaration. और उसमें इन्होंने क्या किया? He denounced the war. He said it's a war of aggression and it's a war of conquest. He accused the government of deliberate prolongation of the war. It happens and it's not true. कि government जानबूझ के prolongate कर रही है war को and we are the people suffering. So he refused to continue fighting and he sent this statement to his commanding officer, and it was read aloud in the House of Commons, which is the British Parliament, and it was also pinned in the newspapers. Now, in wartime, refusing a military service could be treated as mutiny or even treason. Serious crimes punishable by imprisonment or even execution. So, इनको court martial के threats आए. The army could have court-martialed Sassoon, put him on a military trial, but then it got solved because it was said that he is not mentally sound right now. Okay. Next is Eisen Rosenberg, 1890. So he'll come before all of them. He was Jewish, working class poet, very experimental and modernist in tone. He was killed in battle, and he wrote Break of Day in the Trenches, Dead Man's Dump, Poppies whose roots are in man's veins. Ivor Gurney, 1890, same. Soldiers and composers suffered mental health issues post-war. He wrote about landscape and trauma that the soldiers actually suffered from. So he's famous for Severn and Somme, War's Embers. Edward Thomas, he was born much earlier in 1878. He was again a nature poet turned soldier, not very famous, okay, as compared to Owen and Sassoon. But yes, he was a nature poet who turned to being a soldier, so he blends pastoral beauty with war's intrusions. अभी तक तो नेचर सुंदर थी, अब ये क्या हो गया? He also died at the Battle of Arras, and he wrote poems like Rain as the team's head brass. Key themes, what are the key themes overall? Horrors of war, gas attack, death, trauma, disillusionment, loss of heroic ideals like Rosenberg and Thomas have given us. Grief and mourning, Owen ka anthem hai. Irony and satire, Sassoon mainly. And nature versus mechanized war, that's Thomas and Gurney. Brotherhood and isolation bhi hai, the board of soldiers and alienation from civilians. But that's more of a patriotic side of it, right? Here is the chronological list of war poets. Now, I have included even other poets who were not in the war, but at times they have written about war. For example, Thomas Hardy. He has also, now you can get that in as a question, and you will say, oh, Thomas Hardy, he is not a war poet, but he has written about World War. Though not a soldier, he wrote about World War I in later poetry, like the Dynasts, Drummer Hodge, a pre-war literary influence, okay. Kipling also, again not a trench poet, but part of war discourse after losing his son in World War I. Lawrence Binion, a civilian war poet, famous for the Fallen, They Shall Not Grow Old, Not Old. Edward Thomas, nature poet turned soldier, killed in action, combines pastoral lyricism and war reality. So these are the early ones. Uske baad we have Siegfried Sassoon, main ones. So I've put them in different color, the main ones. Rupert Brooke, Eisen Rosenberg, Ivor Gurney also, Wilfredowen, Robert Graves. Now Robert Graves, again, he survived the war. That is how he is different from the others. But he was psychologically scarred. Goodbye to all that. एक autobiographical work है. Apart from that, we have Edward Brittain, 95. Less known but linked with Vera Brittain's Testament of Youth. He died in battle. Okay. So a bit about these major ones. Siegfried Sassoon. I am a soldier convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. So if we talk about a bit about Sassoon, he was born in 1886 in England. He died September 1st, 1967. He went to Cambridge, did not graduate. He came from a wealthy Anglo-Jewish family, Catholic family, and he was classically educated. He was very interested in sports as well, and he was a hunter. But then war happened. He entered the Royal Welsh Fusiliers in World War I. He was very decorated for bravery. He was a brave officer, but then he became bitter, disillusioned, right? Let's come to the major works. The Old Huntsman and the other poems. It is a mixture of pre-war, war, satirical poems. Then, notable. इसी में है They, which satirizes religious and political hypocrisy. We have the Rear Guard. It's very gritty, grotesque image of a soldier in the trenches. This is his major one. Very important. Counterattack and Other Poems, 1918. Now this one, his most famous, very significant war poetry collection, जिसमें counterattack and सबसे important work, graphic very graphic. Disillusionment is shown. Base details, the general glory of women, all of these are included in Counterattack and other poems. Then Memoirs of an Infantry Officer. It's fictionalized autobiographical prose. It's part of Sassoon's, please write down, please mark, Sherston trilogy. इनका trilogy है एक Sherston trilogy. It chronicles war experience through George Sherton. George Sherton is actually his alter ego. Okay? And he uses a very bitter tone, ironic tone, sometimes very dark. Very graphic depictions of trench warfare, blood, filth, and traditional form use किया है, usually ironic. And please write down which are the 3 works in Sherston trilogy. First is Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man. Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man. Second is Memoirs of an Infantry Officer. And third is Sherton's Progress in this trilogy. Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man, Memoirs of an Infantry Officer, and Sherton's Progress in chronology. Okay. Key poems: They, The General, Glory of Women, Suicide in the Trenches, and of course you have to read a bit about them. Whenever you get the chance, please read a bit about the poems. Okay. I'll move on to Rupert Brooke. If I should die, think only this of me, that there is some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. It's a very famous quote from Soldier. Now, Rupert Brooke was born in 1887, England. He died on April 23rd, 1915, hospital ship pay, because he was suffering from blood poisoning. And he went to rugby school, again elite, King's College, Cambridge, and he's associated also with the Georgian poets, and sometimes his name is associated with Bloomsbury group as well. Brooke was a very charming and idealistic young poet, and looks bhi bahut achhi thi. Enjoyed strong literary connections. He had friends like Virginia Woolf, Foster, Churchill, the Bloomsbury people, and he was deeply influenced by the Romanticism. That is why I think he's written these patriotic, very idealistic poems also. But his early death, good looks, and idealistic poetry turned him into a symbol of lost youth in wartime, who would have bloomed, who would have achieved much more, but war happened. So he was enlisted again in the Royal Naval Division, naval usme the ye, and he never saw the frontline combat, but he died of this septicemia, which is from an infected mosquito bite. Fate during Gallipoli expedition. So he's buried on the Greek island. कई बार ऐसा होता है ना, you born somewhere and then you die somewhere. It's very sad. So of Skyros he died. Major works: 1914 and Other Poems contains his most famous 5 sonnets on war: Peace, Safety, The Death, Part 1, Part 2, and The Soldier. इन सॉनेट्स में इन्होंने डिपिक्ट किया है वॉर को एज नोबल, क्लेंजिंग समहाउ, स्पिरिचुअली अपलिफ्टिंग, a stark contrast to the grim realism of later war poets like Owen and Sassoon. Okay, so he's used sonnet form, remember, very idealistic tone, patriotic tone, death as transcendence, love of England, spiritual renewal through sacrifice, innocence, and he's talked about nature, purity again. Georgian poetry का influence है. So The Soldier was his most iconic poem, and he presents death in war as glorious and as meaningful. He uses religious and pastoral imagery also. He says, a dust whom England bore, shaped and made aware. So he reflects pre-trench warfare optimism अभी भी है इनके works में. It was very common before the grim realities actually set in. जब वॉर ख़त्म ही नहीं हो रही थी, चली ही जा रही थी और लोग मर ही जा रहे थे, कॉमन पीपल वर डाइंग ऑफ कोर्स. So initially he was celebrated as a national hero poet, Churchill has praised him. Post-war critics viewed his work as naive because disillusionment set in. तो फिर इनके works को naive और detached कहा from the war's brutality, that you're only glorifying everything. But he's seen as a symbol of early war romanticism before poets like Owen and Isaac Rosenberg exposed the horrors of the war. So these are a little bit of summaries that you can see later on. The Dead Part 1, Part 2, all the 5 sonnets basically. Then we have Isaac Rosenberg. The darkness crumbles away. It is the same old druid time as ever. This is from Break of Day in the Trenches. Isaac Rosenberg was born in 1890, England. He passed in 1918. He was killed in action. So he was a son, he came from a poor Lithuanian Jewish immigrant थे इसके father. He grew up in London's East End among the working class Jewish communities. So he went to the Slade School of Fine Arts. He was a poet and a painter as well. And then he enlisted. War happened in the British Army in 1950, despite poor health. He served as a private. Private, पता है क्या होता है? It's the lowest rank of a soldier when you enter. जैसे white belt होती है ना कराटे में, वैसे private. Unlike many officer poets like Brooke and Sassoon, he was a private. He was a lowest ranking soldier. That's the reason I think he died in action also. He faced anti-Semitism because he was Jewish. Anti-Semitism is hatred towards Jewish community. And he also faced class prejudice. He was only 27 when he died in combat. So poetic style very dense. और उस time तक इन्होंने poetry भी लिखी. So yeah, very harsh, unsentimental view of war he has given us. Not romanticized at all. Death, decay, nature, the body, Jewish identity, existential crisis, all of these are the themes. And influences are Blake, Keats, modernist free verse, also Hebraic imagery. Okay? And these are his major works. Break of Day in the Trenches is the most famous one. Little bit of summary is written, but I would suggest if you go through the text, it would be nice. Of course, if the texts are smaller, you can go through them. If they are bigger texts, then skip. Sonnets हैं तो आप sonnets तो देख सकते हो. Dead Man's Dump also. So, okay. Returning, we hear the larks and louse hunting. These are his major works. Not talking about this now. So here it ends. The war poets. I hope that you've gotten an idea of what war poetry looked like, how chronologically it unfolded, and what is the chronology, of course, of the war poets. That is important. I'll go back to that. And what they were writing about, what were their lives like, and how they died. Right? So now your part is to go through their major works, read out the names of their poetry. You might get it in Match the Following as well. Okay? And once again, if you want to take part in our classes or MCQs, do it quickly, please. Don't wait for a long time. Invest in yourself. Okay? If you keep thinking, oh, should I spend, should I not spend? You have to invest, only then you will get something in return. And once you get in return, you will have much more than you are to invest. Okay? So don't think about it much. If you want it, take it. And please share this with others who you might know doing their MA or preparing for any of the exams, whether it is HPSC or any other PSC exam, or of course NET exam. And put in your thoughts in the comments. I love to read them because otherwise we're not able to talk. And subscribe if you haven't, please. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next session.